November 19, 1953. Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. A wood-paneled cabin in the cold autumn forest. A group of 9 men in dark suits are sitting around a fireplace. They are scientists. They work for the CIA, for the U.S. Army, for the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick. They are some of the most highly cleared men in American intelligence. One of them, a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, stands up to pour drinks. He brings out a bottle of Cointreau, an orange liqueur. He pours 9 glasses. A man named Frank Olson takes one of the glasses. He is 43 years old. He is a respected biological warfare scientist. He has a wife and 3 children waiting for him at home in Maryland. He raises the glass to his colleagues. He takes a drink. What Frank Olson does not know is that Sidney Gottlieb has just spiked his drink with 70 micrograms of LSD. And what Frank Olson is about to learn over the next 9 days will end with him going through a 10th-floor hotel window in Manhattan in the middle of the night. The CIA will tell his family it was suicide. They will not tell his family the truth for another 22 years. This is the story of Project MKUltra and the scientist who knew too much. For 2 decades, the United States government ran one of the most disturbing programs in the history of American intelligence. They called it Project MKUltra. They dosed unwitting American citizens with LSD. They hired CIA-paid prostitutes to lure men off the street into safe houses where they could be drugged. They funded experiments in psychological torture. They tested techniques that originated in Nazi concentration camps. The program lasted from 1953 to 1973. It involved 149 separate sub-projects. It conducted experiments on at least 153 test subjects without their consent. It cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in modern money. When the program was finally exposed in 1975, the CIA director responsible had ordered all the documents destroyed. Almost everything we know today comes from a small batch of records that survived because they had been misfiled. This story is about one man, Frank Olson, the first known American to die in an MKUltra experiment, the man whose death cracked the program open. But to understand why he died, you have to understand why MKUltra existed in the first place, and why the United States government decided that some of its own citizens were acceptable losses in a war that was never declared. Frank Olson was born in Hurley, Wisconsin in 1910. He was a brilliant student. He earned a doctorate in bacteriology from the University of Wisconsin. By the time he was 35, he was working at Fort Detrick in Maryland, the center of America's biological warfare research program. By 1953, he was the acting chief of the Special Operations Division. He was one of about 24 men in the entire United States who knew the full scope of America's secret biological weapons program. He had a top-secret clearance. He had been involved in research that nobody outside his small circle knew existed. He was also a man with 3 children. His son Eric was 9 years old, his daughter Lisa was 7, his son Niels was 5. They lived in a comfortable suburban home outside Frederick, Maryland. Frank Olson was, by every account, a devoted father. But in the summer of 1953, his colleagues began to notice something different about him. Frank Olson was uncomfortable. He had recently traveled to Europe. He had visited a CIA black site in West Germany where Soviet defectors were being interrogated. He had visited a Norwegian facility where the CIA was testing biological agents on test subjects. When he came back, his wife Alice noticed that he was not himself. He was not sleeping well. He told her, vaguely, that he had seen things he did not like. He told a colleague that he was thinking about leaving Fort Detrick. He told another colleague, more specifically, that he was thinking about leaving the entire intelligence community. For a man who knew the secrets that Frank Olson knew, this was not a small problem. In November of 1953, Olson was invited to a retreat at Deep Creek Lake. The official purpose of the retreat was to discuss biological warfare research. The actual purpose was something else. Sidney Gottlieb, the head of MK Ultra, was conducting an experiment. He wanted to test what happened when men in his program were dosed with LSD without their knowledge. He wanted to see what they would say. He wanted to see if they could keep secrets. Olson and 7 of his colleagues were dosed that night. The other men handled the experience reasonably well. They spent the night drunk, confused, and disoriented, but they recovered. By the next morning, most of them were back to themselves. Frank Olson did not recover. In the days after the retreat, he became increasingly paranoid. He began telling Alice that he had made a terrible mistake, that he wanted to quit, that he was afraid for his family. He began to describe things he had seen in Europe that, until that moment, he had refused to discuss with anyone. His colleagues at the CIA grew concerned. A man with Frank Olson's clearance, in a state of psychological collapse, telling his wife about the things he had seen in Europe, was not just a personal tragedy. He was a national security threat. A decision was made. Olson was told he needed to see a doctor. He was put in a car with 2 CIA officers and driven to New York City. He was checked into the Hotel Statler, room 1018A, on the 10th floor. The doctor he was supposed to see was a man named Harold Abramson, an allergist with no formal psychiatric training, who had also been working for MK Ultra for years. For 9 days, the men who had been ordered to take care of Frank Olson kept him in that hotel room. And on the 10th night, Frank Olson went out the window. To understand why Frank Olson was killed, you have to understand the program that killed him. MK Ultra was approved by CIA Director Allen Dulles on April 13, 1953. The Cold War was at its peak. The CIA believed that the Soviets, the Chinese, and the North Koreans had developed mind control techniques. American prisoners of war returning from Korea had given confessions that seemed unnaturally easy. The CIA was convinced that the enemy had figured out how to break a human mind on demand. They wanted the same capability. The man chosen to lead this program was Sidney Gottlieb. He was a chemist with a background in biology. He had a club foot. He wore wool sweaters and made his own goat cheese. He grew his own vegetables. He was, in many ways, an ordinary man. He was also one of the most morally compromised figures in the history of American intelligence. Under Gottlieb's leadership, MK Ultra ran experiments on prisoners, mental patients, drug addicts, prostitutes, and children. Some of the experiments involved giving subjects massive doses of LSD for weeks at a time. Some involved sensory deprivation. Some involved electroshock. Some involved hypnosis, combined with drugs. Gottlieb's most infamous program was called Operation Midnight Climax. He set up a CIA-run brothel in San Francisco. CIA-paid prostitutes lured men off the street into the safe house, where the men were given drinks secretly dosed with LSD. Behind a one-way mirror, a CIA agent named George White sat sipping martinis and watching the drugged men. White later wrote a letter explaining why he loved the assignment. He wrote that it was the only job in the world where, with the official sanction of the United States government, he could lie, kill, cheat, steal, deceive, and harm people without consequence. The men who walked into that San Francisco safe house never knew they were being experimented on. They never gave consent. They were ordinary American men, sailors on shore leave, salesmen, Truck drivers. They thought they were paying for sex. They were actually being used as human test subjects in a CIA experiment. This program ran for years. It is impossible to know how many men were dosed in that one safe house alone, much less the other safe houses that the CIA opened in New York and Marin County. The records were destroyed before they could be counted. But Operation Midnight Climax was just one sub-project of MK Ultra. There were 148 others. The CIA contracted with universities, hospitals, prisons, and military bases. Donald Ewan Cameron, a respected Scottish-Canadian psychiatrist, ran an MK Ultra-funded experiment in Montreal, where he subjected mental patients to weeks of forced sleep, repeated electroshock, and LSD doses in an attempt to erase and rewrite their personalities. Some of his patients were left unable to recognize their own families. Some never spoke again. A young Stanford student named Ken Kesey volunteered for an MK Ultra experiment with LSD in 1959. The experience inspired him to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He also became one of the most famous promoters of LSD in 1960s American counterculture. The CIA had inadvertently invented the psychedelic revolution. Even more disturbing, the program drew directly on Nazi research. The CIA hired German and Japanese scientists who had run human experiments in concentration camps and prison camps during World War II. The Operation Paperclip program, which brought Nazi scientists to America, supplied MK Ultra with researchers whose work had been built on the corpses of Holocaust victims. This is the program that Frank Olson was part of. The program that he was beginning to question. The program that he was about to walk away from. Here is what nobody understood for 40 years. Frank Olson did not have a bad reaction to LSD. Frank Olson was not just a depressed scientist with a bad trip. Frank Olson was killed because he had seen something specific in Europe in the months before his death that he could not unsee. In 2002, his son Eric Olson made a public announcement. He said that his father had been murdered. He said that his father had been pushed out of that hotel window. And he said that the reason was not just that Frank Olson knew about MK Ultra. It was that Frank Olson had witnessed something worse. According to Eric Olson, his father had visited a CIA black site in West Germany during his European trip in the summer of 1953. At that black site, Soviet defectors were being interrogated using techniques that included biological agents that Frank Olson had developed at Fort Detrick. Some of those defectors had died. Frank Olson, the bacteriologist, the family man from Wisconsin, had stood in a room and watched the CIA kill men using weapons he had personally created. He had come back to Maryland a different person. He had told his wife he had made a terrible mistake. He had told his colleagues he wanted to leave the intelligence community. The retreat at Deep Creek Lake was not a random experiment. The LSD in his Cointreau was not an accident. It was a test. The CIA wanted to know what Frank Olson would say when his inhibitions were chemically lowered. They wanted to know if he could keep their secrets. He failed the test. The night of November 28, 1953. Hotel Statler, Manhattan, room 1018A. Frank Olson is sharing the room with Robert Lashbrook, a CIA officer who has been assigned to watch him. Lashbrook works directly under Sidney Gottlieb. He is a chemist. He is also, by his own later admission, the man who poured the LSD into Olson's drink at Deep Creek Lake. According to the CIA's official account, Olson had spent 9 days in New York being treated by Harold Abramson, the MK Ultra-affiliated allergist. Olson had agreed to be admitted to a psychiatric facility the following morning. Lashbrook had been ordered to keep an eye on him through the night. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, according to Lashbrook's account, Frank Olson got out of bed, walked across the hotel room, and threw himself through the closed window. He fell 10 stories. The window did not break apart. Olson went through it. Lashbrook called the CIA emergency line first. He called the police second. The case was officially recorded as suicide. Frank Olson's family was told that he had been suffering from psychiatric problems and had taken his own life. They were given a small settlement. They were not told about the LSD. They were not told about MK Ultra. They were not told about anything. For 22 years, the Olson family lived with that lie. Then, in 1975, a Senate investigation triggered by Watergate uncovered a small batch of MK Ultra documents that had survived the destruction order. Among them was a reference to a death. A man dosed at a retreat. A man who had gone out a hotel window in Manhattan. President Gerald Ford invited the Olson family to the White House. He apologized on behalf of the United States government. He told them that their husband and father had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge. He told them that the LSD had likely contributed to his death. The family received a settlement of $750,000. CIA Director William Colby personally apologized to them. The family thought for a long time that they finally knew the truth. But Eric Olson, the son who had been 9 years old when his father died, did not believe it. He spent the next 20 years investigating his father's death. And in 1994, he had his father's body exhumed. The original autopsy in 1953 had been brief and incomplete. The 1954 autopsy was thorough. The forensic team found something that the original autopsy had missed. There was a hematoma on Frank Olson's skull, on the left temple. The injury was consistent with a heavy blow to the head, delivered before the fall. The forensic pathologist, James Starrs, concluded that the evidence was consistent with homicide. Frank Olson had likely been struck unconscious in the hotel room before he went through the window. Here is what nobody talks about. In 1973, when the Watergate scandal began to threaten the CIA, the director of the agency was a man named Richard Helms. Helms knew about MK Ultra. He knew about Frank Olson. He knew that if the program was ever fully exposed, the CIA would face the worst public reckoning in its history. Helms made a decision. He went to Sidney Gottlieb. He ordered Gottlieb to destroy every record of MK Ultra. Gottlieb personally drove to the CIA Records Center. He told the archivists which boxes to destroy. He watched as 20 years of documents on one of the most ethically catastrophic programs in American history were burned, shredded, and lost forever. The records of 149 sub-projects, the names of test subjects, the techniques that had been developed, the locations of the safe houses, the deaths, all gone. The reason we know anything about MK Ultra at all is that 20,000 pages of financial records had been misfiled in a warehouse, separate from the main archive. Those documents survived because nobody had bothered to look for them. They were discovered in 1977 through a Freedom of Information Act request. Almost everything else was destroyed. This means that we will never know the full scope of what Sidney Gottlieb did. We will never know how many people were dosed. We will never know how many died. We will never know how many lives were destroyed by Donald Cameron's experiments in Montreal. We will never know how many men walked out of that San Francisco safe house with permanent psychological damage. We will never know. Frank Olson is the only victim with a name and a face in the public record. Every other victim has been erased. Their suffering exists only in the small handful of testimonies that survived and the financial records that escaped the burn. This is the part that should haunt every person watching this video. The reason MK Ultra is one of the most disturbing programs in American history is not just what they did. It is that we know they did much more than this, and the men responsible made sure we will never know how much. The truth was destroyed, by design, by the men who knew it. Sidney Gottlieb retired in 1973. He moved to the Virginia countryside. He raised goats. He grew vegetables. He died in his sleep in 1999 at the age of 81. He never faced any criminal charges. He died a free man. Robert Lashbrook, the CIA officer who shared the hotel room with Frank Olson on the night he died, lived until 2003. He never faced charges either. Eric Olson, the son who exhumed his father's body, is still alive. He is still investigating. He has spent more than 70 years of his life trying to prove what happened in that hotel room. He has never received a final answer. In 2012, the Olson family filed a federal lawsuit against the United States government, alleging that Frank Olson was murdered to prevent him from disclosing what he had seen in Europe. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2013. The court ruled that the statute of limitations had run out. Frank Olson has been dead for 73 years. The men who killed him are also dead. The records that would prove what happened were destroyed 40 years before most people watching this video were born. But here is the question that matters today. If your government decided that you knew too much, that your conscience had become inconvenient, that your willingness to speak the truth had become a national security threat, what would you trust to protect you? The answer is whatever protected Frank Olson on the night of November 28, 1953. Which is to say, nothing. If this story moved you, watch our Betrayed collection where we cover the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, another story of American institutions experimenting on their own citizens without consent. Each video in this series is connected by the same haunting thread: the people who trusted their government and the price they paid for that trust. And here is your question for the comments. If you were Frank Olson on the morning of November 19, 1953, sitting at a CIA retreat in Maryland, would you have refused the drink? Or would you have trusted the colleagues you had worked with for years and taken the glass like he did? There is no easy answer. That is what makes this story so unbearable. Subscribe for more dark histories. New episode next week.